looking for Annie Williams. We have reason to believe she is at this facility.
I don't care what reason you have. You are not approaching any of my residents without a judicial warrant and proper clearance.
We're federal agents. We don't need your permission.
Actually, you do. This is a licensed care facility. We have resident privacy laws, patient protection.
The standoff happened at 3:15 p.m. on a chilly winter afternoon in the east wing of Sunrise Gardens Elder Care Home in Minneapolis. What started as four masked ICE agents demanding access to an 81-year-old resident would escalate into an entire hallway of care staff forming a human barrier to protect their charge. A heart-wrenching confrontation captured on facility security cameras that would go viral within hours. And a federal lawsuit that would ultimately award Annie Williams $13.7 million while exposing the perilous clash between immigration enforcement and the sanctity of elder care. If you're ready to witness ageism and racism dismantled, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of everyday heroes standing up to power. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this story. Annie Williams was 81 years old, a retired school teacher who'd been living at Sunrise Gardens for 8 years. She was Black Haitian-American, born in Port-au-Prince, but brought to the United States as a 7-year-old when her family fled political turmoil and violence. She'd grown up in Chicago, attended public schools, earned her teaching degree on scholarships while balancing night shifts, and dedicated 40 years to educating inner-city kids who mirrored her own struggles, overlooked, undervalued, eager for a mentor to see their potential. She was legendary in her prime. The kind of teacher who turned failing students into graduates, the kind who could break down history lessons into stories that ignited curiosity, the kind who volunteered weekends for literacy programs and never turned away a child in need. Her classrooms were vibrant hubs of learning, her methods innovative. Her former students, now adults, still credited her for their successes. Yet in her later years at Sunrise Gardens, her brilliance was forgotten. Staff dismissed her as difficult or forgetful, ignoring her requests for culturally appropriate meals or better reading materials. Her suggestions for resident activities were brushed off in meetings. She'd been passed over for resident council leadership multiple times, always for vague reasons, always in favor of others with less insight and weaker voices. She was a U.S. citizen by naturalization since age 21. She had the certificate framed in her room, alongside her passport and voting records. She'd paid taxes faithfully. She'd even served as a poll worker in her 60 seconds, clearing background checks effortlessly. She was as American as apple pie, with paperwork to back it up. That winter afternoon, Annie was in her cozy room in the East Wing, overlooking a snow-dusted garden, midway through her daily routine, a quiet afternoon of reading a history book on Haitian independence. Her mind sharp as ever, despite the frailty of her body. She adjusted her glasses, turning pages with hands that trembled slightly from age, but her focus was unwavering. She believed in lifelong learning, in meeting the world where it was, not where others assumed it should be. The boots hit the lobby floor with precision. 4 masked ICE agents stormed into Sunrise Gardens at that exact moment, 3:15 p.m., their tactical gear gleaming under the fluorescent lights, their movements sharp and unyielding. The chilly winter afternoon outside had been tranquil moments before snow dusting the gardens, residents settling into their routines, the hum of afternoon calm filling the halls. Now, that peace shattered. The lead agent barked Annie Williams's name at the front desk, thrusting an administrative warrant toward Lila's face with the weight of assumed authority. The wide-eyed young aide hesitated, her fingers trembling as she glanced at the document, then gestured vaguely toward the East Wing. The agents didn't wait for clarification. They barreled past her, their icy emblazoned vests cutting through the stillness, their boots echoing down the corridor like drumbeats of intrusion. In her room, Annie paused mid-sentence in her reading. The murmurs from the hallway grew louder. Residents in nearby rooms stirred. Confusion spreading like ripples through still water. The agents loomed in the corridor now, their presence disrupting the atmosphere as though stones had been dropped into a tranquil pond. One agent advanced, voice booming to clear the path. The facility's protocols for law enforcement were ironclad. All visitors, especially authorities, had to sign in, coordinate with administration, and adhere to health and privacy guidelines. These agents had ignored it all, bypassing reception, skipping logs, marching into a space housing the vulnerable as if rules were optional. Their excuse, barked in terse commands, was an anonymous tip. Someone had flagged Annie Williams as undocumented, as an intruder who didn't belong. A few staff members in the hallway caught the disruption and converged, questions flying. A caregiver demanded they halt. An orderly stepped forward, blocking one agent. The air crackled with tension. These were caretakers trained to shield the frail, their residence, their home. The agents shoved onward, claiming rights to verify Annie's status, to detain her if needed, to remove her immediately without proof on hand. Facility Director Kristin Davidson burst from her office at the wing's end, alerted by the commotion. She was in her 40 seconds, composed yet fierce, a leader who viewed protocols as shields for the defenseless, not hurdles to leap. She strode to Annie's door, planting herself squarely between the agents and the entrance. Her tone was steady but unbreakable. She demanded a judicial warrant. She referenced resident rights laws. She cited health privacy protections. Without a proper judicial warrant, no further steps would be permitted. The agents summoned reinforcements via radio. They warned of obstruction penalties. They argued their administrative warrant sufficed. Davidson stood firm, making it clear, an administrative warrant was not enough to enter a vulnerable resident's room. She alerted security. She phoned the facility's legal team. She barred the door with her frame, a line the agents couldn't cross without force. Head nurse Brenda Phillips joined her, rallying more staff. A dozen caregivers appeared, nurses, aides, the activities coordinator, the night shift supervisor. They formed a tight semicircle around Annie's door, bodies aligning without words, without rehearsal. It was pure instinct. A united front to guard one of their own. Inside her room, Annie sat in her armchair, pulse racing, fingers clutching her book like an anchor. She recalled her naturalization oath at 21, the swell of pride. She thought of her passport in the drawer, irrelevant now. She considered the residents peering out, witnessing this. She stayed silent, refusing engagement without legal counsel. It was her quiet armor, forged from decades of being dismissed, neglected, unseen. The security cameras rolled, capturing it all in vivid detail. Agents' gear, staff's resolute circle, Davidson's immovable stance. The deadlock dragged on, residents whispering, some filming discreetly on phones. The vibe was charged yet controlled, a live-wire impasse with no easy end. Annie's thoughts wandered unbidden to her arrival in America at 7. The havoc in Port-au-Prince, her family's desperate flight, the wrenching separation from her younger sister amid the chaos presumed lost forever in the shuffle of borders and systems. She remembered her parents' endless labor to survive. She recalled scholarships, exhaustive studies, the solitude of excelling, while others coasted. She thought of her teaching career, thrilling at first, then marred by subtle slights, innovations ignored, promotions denied, her voice silenced in rooms where lesser talents shone. The human shield tightened, staff sharing nods, unspoken bonds. Davidson invoked facility rights, reiterating legal mandates the agents flouted. She held the line. The agents tried flanking, weaving through. Staff adjusted, ranks closing. No shouts, no shoves, just steadfast presence, a tapestry of allyship transcending backgrounds. The standoff hit its 20th minute when agents' radios buzzed with updates. Backup stalled, lawyers en route. Frustration etched their postures, shifting from arrogance to agitation. They hurled threats. But they stalled. Crossing would invite assault claims against caregivers, unjustifiable. Annie, shielded by her protectors, felt a flicker amid the fear. She'd endured worse neglect in the home, where her demands for dignity were labeled burdensome, her stories of past activism dismissed as ramblings of the elderly. She'd been humiliated by aides who rushed her care, ignored her pains, treated her as invisible. But she harbored a secret power, buried deep. In her youth, she'd been a quiet force in the civil rights underground, smuggling documents and aiding Haitian refugees under a pseudonym. Her lost sister wasn't just separated, she'd been part of Annie's covert network, deported after a betrayal Annie had never forgiven herself for. This hidden identity, this unseen legacy of resistance, would soon surface as her ultimate strength. Facility security arrived at the 25-minute mark. 4 guards in crisp uniforms eased into the hall, gauging the scene with measured calm. Briefed by Davidson, they knew, federal agents. No judicial warrant. Ongoing threat. The lead guard, a veteran named Elias, consulted Davidson, then addressed the agents coolly. Any resident interaction required admin coordination and a proper judicial warrant, legal counsel incoming. Wait in the lobby or depart. The masked men lingered, radios hissing, irritation evident in fidgeting vests and glances. The stalemate endured 30 minutes total, every tick documented undeniably. Agents outflanked by rules they'd skirted, their administrative warrant insufficient for the task they'd attempted. At 3:45 p.m., the facility's legal team arrived. 2 sharp-eyed attorneys in tailored suits strode into the East Wing, briefcases in hand, expressions hardened by urgency. They'd been briefed en route. Federal agents, administrative warrant, elderly resident, no judicial authorization. Davidson met them at the barrier, handing over documentation while the agents shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado dimming under professional scrutiny. The lead attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, examined the administrative warrant with surgical precision. She flipped through pages, cross-referenced codes, consulted briefly with her colleague. Her conclusion was swift and damning. The warrant was inadequate for detaining a resident in a care facility. It lacked judicial oversight. It failed to account for due process protections afforded to vulnerable populations. It disregarded health and privacy disruptions inherent in forcibly removing an elderly woman from her home. Chen addressed the agents with clinical detachment. They could proceed through proper channels, obtain a judicial warrant, coordinate with facility administration, provide adequate notice, or they could leave immediately and avoid compounding their violations. The choice was theirs, but any attempt to cross the threshold now would result in immediate legal action for trespass, assault, and interference with resident care. The agents withdrew at 3:48 p.m., their retreat stiff and begrudging, radios crackling with vows of follow-up and repercussions. Davidson watched them disappear down the corridor, her guard unwavering until they'd cleared the building entirely. Only then did the tension break. Staff exhaled collectively, the strain uncoiling in waves of relief. Caregivers embraced Annie, their voices soft with reassurance, their hands gentle on her trembling shoulders. She'd held herself together throughout, armor intact, but now the adrenaline faded and left her shaking. Davidson escorted her to a quiet lounge away from the cameras and curious eyes, promising full support, legal backing, whatever resources she needed. The facility would document everything. Annie wasn't alone. But the mystery loomed heavy. Why target her? She was a citizen, documented, records clear as crystal. What tip could possibly justify this intrusion? That evening, Annie's daughter Diane arrived from Chicago, her face drawn with worry and rage. She'd been briefed by phone during the drive, but seeing her mother in person still visibly shaken, still processing the violation ignited something fierce in her. She'd already contacted an immigration specialist, Dorothy Thompson, a woman with a reputation for dismantling wrongful enforcement actions. They met in a small conference room at Sunrise Gardens, Annie still in her robe, hands clasped tight around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Thompson wasted no time. She dove into databases, demanded disclosure of the anonymous tip, cross-referenced ICE records with meticulous efficiency. What she uncovered was both crushing and illuminating. An anonymous caller had labeled Annie Williams as undocumented. ICE's system had matched her to a deportation order, not hers, but her younger sister's. The sister who'd been separated during their family's chaotic escape from Port-au-Prince decades ago. The sister who'd been deported in 2009 under a botched identity match after a Florida immigration sweep, the bureaucratic errors compounding until she'd been removed from the country despite having a valid asylum claim. But there was more. Thompson dug deeper, and the enthralling twist emerged like a blade from shadow. Annie hadn't just mourned her sister's loss. For decades, she'd quietly operated in the civil rights underground, using a pseudonym to smuggle documents, fund legal defenses, and aid Haitian refugees navigating the treacherous immigration system. She'd searched for her sister relentlessly, using her covert network to track leads, challenge deportations, expose corruption within enforcement agencies. Her lost sister hadn't just been family, she'd been part of Annie's network, a fellow advocate until the betrayal that led to her deportation. And the anonymous tipster? A former ICE insider Annie had anonymously exposed years ago for accepting bribes and falsifying records. The man had lost his position, his pension, his reputation. Now, it seemed he'd found his revenge weaponizing the very system he'd once corrupted to target the woman who'd brought him down. This hidden identity provided irrefutable evidence. Annie had kept meticulous files, letters, encrypted communications, financial records of her advocacy work, documentation of the insider's corruption. It proved beyond doubt that this wasn't bureaucratic negligence. It was targeted harassment, retaliation disguised as enforcement. The lawsuit's scope expanded instantly. Fourth Amendment violations for unlawful detention attempts, Fifth Amendment due process denials, 14th Amendment equal protection breaches, and now retaliation claims that carried punitive weight. The security footage leaked that night. A staffer, shaken by what they'd witnessed, uploaded a 45-second clip to social media with a simple caption: Care home staff shield elderly black woman from masked ICE raid. Solidarity in action. By dawn, it had gone viral. The visuals were raw and visceral. Davidson planting herself as a barrier, her stance immovable. Phillips rallying the circle of caregivers, their bodies forming an impenetrable wall. The agents' tactical gear, their aggressive postures, their eventual retreat. It struck chords across demographics, across generations, across ideological lines. Headlines surged. Care home blocks ICE intrusion in Minneapolis. Staff human shield saves resident from wrongful detention. Viral video exposes elder targeting. Media outlets dissected every frame, hailing Davidson and Phillips' leadership as beacons against institutional overreach. Advocates decried ICE recklessness, the dangers of anonymous tips, the agency's failure to verify even basic information before deploying armed agents into a sanctuary for the vulnerable. Care workers nationwide shared parallel tales, fueling a groundswell of support for Annie and mounting criticism of enforcement tactics in spaces meant to protect the defenseless. The footage became a symbol, a rallying cry. Public outrage swelled with each share, each comment, each news segment. Amid the viral spread and the swelling comments affirming the need to protect vulnerable spaces, the question emerged organically in online discussions: should elder homes be declared raid-free zones? The consensus leaned heavily toward yes, with thousands sharing the story, dropping comments about why allyship like this deserved more visibility, why it resonated so deeply in a moment when institutional failure seemed endless. Annie viewed the clip at home with Diane, watching herself through the window of her room, clutching her book, surrounded by protectors she barely knew yet who'd risked everything for her. The terror and humiliation of those 30 minutes alchemized into something else now: purpose, resolve. A refusal to let this violation stand unanswered. She greenlit the federal lawsuit. Thompson filed against ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, citing the full spectrum of constitutional violations, seeking compensatory damages for emotional distress and punitive damages to deter future negligence. Discovery launched swiftly, and the revelations were damning. Emails exposed agents ignoring verification protocols, chasing the anonymous tip without cross-checking records that were publicly accessible. Depositions admitted to tool shortages, outdated systems, a culture that prioritized speed and quotas over rights and accuracy. The defense's position crumbled under the weight of evidence that Annie's citizenship status could have been confirmed with a single phone call, a single database query. The lawsuit spanned 9 months. During that time, Annie resumed her routine at Sunrise Gardens, but something had shifted. Staff who'd once dismissed her now sought her counsel. Her suggestions for resident activities were suddenly valued. Her wisdom, long overlooked, became prized. The recognition was bittersweet. It had taken crisis to illuminate what had always been there, underscoring the years of subtle neglect and outright dismissal she'd endured. One evening, alone in her room, Annie gazed at her naturalization certificate hanging on the wall. The glass gleamed in the lamplight, the document itself worn at the edges from decades of pride and proof. She thought of her sister, still out there somewhere, lost in systems that had failed them both. She thought of the students she'd taught, the lives she'd shaped, the decades of contribution rendered invisible until the moment she needed defending. Justice, she understood now, wasn't a flash of vindication. It was persistence. It was endurance. It was the slow, methodical work of holding power accountable, especially when that power assumed you were too old, too tired, too insignificant to fight back. She hardened her resolve. The trial was coming, and she would see it through. The trial commenced on a brisk fall morning, the federal courthouse steps already crowded with reporters, cameras, advocates carrying signs. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Former students who'd traveled from across the country, care facility representatives observing for their own institutions, immigrant rights activists, elder advocacy groups. The viral clip had transformed Annie's case into something larger than one woman's ordeal. It had become a symbol of systemic failures colliding with vulnerable populations, of everyday people refusing to let injustice pass unchallenged. The proceedings stretched across 5 weeks, each day deliberate and methodical. The prosecution opened by screening the full security footage, not just the viral clip but the entire 30-minute ordeal. The jury watched agents storm the lobby, barrel past staff, advance on a frail woman's room with tactical aggression wholly disproportionate to the task of verifying immigration status. They watched Davidson plant herself as a barrier, Phillips rally the staff, the human shield form without hesitation. Depositions followed, played on screens for the jury. Agents admitted they'd proceeded on name alone, ignoring protocols that required multi-point verification. They acknowledged that Annie's social security number, readily available in databases, didn't match the deportation order. They confessed they'd bypassed safeguards designed precisely to prevent this scenario: armed enforcement descending on vulnerable populations without cause. Testimonies layered the human cost. Staff recounted their instinctive protection, their recognition of Annie's dignity even as the facility had often failed to honor it. They detailed her teaching legacy, her innovative methods, her dedication to students society had written off. They contrasted that brilliance with her treatment at sunrise, requests for culturally appropriate meals denied, suggestions for activities brushed aside, her voice consistently muted despite her sharp intellect and deep experience. The image that emerged was damning. A woman of exceptional achievement rendered invisible by ageism and subtle racism, her worth recognized only when crisis forced it into the light. On day 10, Annie testified. She took the stand steadily, no dramatics, no theatrics. She recounted the fear that had gripped her when the agents appeared, the confusion despite knowing her citizenship was ironclad, the disruption to the fragile peace she'd built in her later years. She shared her naturalization story, the life she'd constructed through scholarships and night shifts and 40 years of service. Then she dropped the bombshell. Her sister's separation during their escape from Port-au-Prince. The deportation in 2009 under a botched identity. But intertwined with that loss was Annie's secret, her decades-long work in the civil rights underground, operating under a pseudonym to smuggle documents and aid Haitian refugees. The searches for her sister that had evolved into a broader mission to prevent others from suffering the same fate. And finally, the revelation of the tipster, a former ICE insider she'd anonymously exposed for corruption years ago, now wielding the system he'd once corrupted to exact revenge. She presented the cached evidence, encrypted files, financial records of her advocacy work, documentation proving the insider's vendetta. The courtroom went silent. Jurors leaned forward. What had seemed like bureaucratic negligence revealed itself as targeted harassment, a weaponization of enforcement power against a woman who'd spent her life fighting for the vulnerable. Expert witnesses dissected the probable cause failures, the verification mandates ignored, the chilling effect such actions had on elder care facilities and immigrant communities. A retired ICE whistleblower testified about the systemic biases, the culture of cutting corners, the technology gaps that enabled these disasters. Former students spoke about the event's impact, how it had shaken them, yet also inspired them to stand for justice, to recognize the power of collective action. The defense claimed good faith, argued they'd followed the anonymous tip in accordance with protocols, but the evidence buried them. Annie's records were publicly verifiable. A phone call to Social Security. A database query. Basic due diligence would have revealed the error instantly. Instead, armed agents had descended on an elder care facility, terrorizing a vulnerable woman based on nothing more than a vengeful tip and systemic laziness. Deliberations lasted 3 days. The jury returned with a unanimous verdict, full liability on all counts. Fourth Amendment violations for the unlawful detention attempt. Fifth Amendment, due process denials. 14th Amendment, equal protection breaches. And the retaliation claims, proven beyond dispute by Annie's meticulous records. The damages, $5 million compensatory for the emotional distress inflicted on an 81-year-old woman, $8.7 million punitive to deter future negligence and send an unmistakable message about accountability, $13.7 million total, a landmark sum that made headlines across the nation. The fallout was immediate. 3 agents were terminated, 2 supervisors demoted. ICE announced sweeping reforms, multi-point verification mandatory for any enforcement action at care facilities, judicial warrants required for resident interactions, enhanced training on vulnerable population protections. Elder care homes nationwide adopted the case as a protocol blueprint, revising their own procedures to prevent similar intrusions. Sunrise Gardens installed a plaque in the East Wing, near Annie's room. The inscription was simple: "United, we shield the vulnerable." It became a permanent reminder of the day ordinary staff became extraordinary defenders. Annie channeled her winnings into a defense fund for threatened elders, partnering with immigrant rights groups for nationwide trainings and advocacy initiatives. The fund ballooned as donations poured in from people inspired by the viral footage, by her testimony, by the proof that resistance could yield justice. She continued living at Sunrise, but her space transformed. Visitors flowed through regularly, former students, advocacy organizers, journalists, care workers from other facilities seeking guidance. Her wisdom, so long neglected, was suddenly prized. The recognition was sweet, yet scarred by the bitter truth that it had taken a federal lawsuit to make her visible. 9 months after the verdict, Annie spoke at a national elder care conference in Atlanta. 1,500 attendees filled the auditorium, the viral footage playing on screens behind her as she walked to the podium. She spoke about enforcement failures, about the power of allyship, about the necessity of visibility for those society renders invisible. She shared her sister's story, her secret activism, her understanding that justice weaves accountability from endurance, not from flash or spectacle. The impact rippled outward. Elder care facilities cited Sunrise as a model. ICE operated under heightened scrutiny, the reforms imperfect but tangible progress. The footage endured as a rallying cry, proof that collective refusal could shift institutional tides. Back in her room at Sunrise one quiet afternoon, Annie prepared for the resident book club she'd finally been allowed to lead. Her hands, still trembling slightly with age, arranged copies of the Haitian independence history she loved. The underdog had ascended. The unseen had been vindicated. But more than that, she'd transmuted pain into enduring change, safeguarding vulnerable elders through methodical justice and resilient truth. Power, she'd proven, could be reclaimed. Not through spectacle but through persistence. Not through noise, but through the quiet, unyielding insistence that systems be held accountable, that truth endure, that justice remain a method deliberate, procedural, and ultimately unstoppable.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.